Nolan Briggs was 3 seconds from signing away the island when his dog put a paw on the paper and refused to move. 45 years old, sleeping in a van behind a lobster co-op, a stranger's pen in his hand, and a number on the line that would have ended every debt he owned. And Rook's 70 pounds of German Shepherd, who had not made a sound in an hour, stood up across the floor and pinned the contract to the table like it was a live thing trying to escape. Nolan didn't know it yet, but that paw just saved 31 names. If you want to see how, subscribe and stay to the end. And drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The pen was still in his hand. That was the part Nolan Briggs would remember later when people asked him how close he came. Not the number, not the man in the navy coat sitting across the table with his hands folded like a priest. The pen, cheap black plastic warm from his own grip, hovering a quarter-inch above a line that had his name typed under it in small, clean letters. And the only thing between him and the rest of his life was a dog who had decided otherwise. "He does that often?" Whitaker Thorne asked. "No," Nolan said. "Then perhaps he's tired." "He's not tired." Rook didn't look at Thorne. He looked at Nolan, and he kept his paw where it was, and he held that look with the flat, patient insistence of an animal who had been asked to do a job once and had never stopped doing it. Nolan set the pen down. He would think about that later too, how easy it had been in the end. Not heroic, not principled. He just set the pen down the way a man sets down a cup of coffee that's gone cold, and something in his chest had loosened a half-inch, and he hadn't understood why. 6 days earlier, he had been asleep in the van. He slept in the van the way a man sleeps in a place he has decided not to name. Not home, not my place. The van. It sat behind the Rockhaven Lobster Co-op on a strip of cracked asphalt, where the owner Dell had told him years ago that he didn't care what anybody parked back there as long as it didn't leak oil and didn't call itself a residence. Nolan had honored both conditions. He fixed the oil pan himself, and he never once called it a residence, not out loud, not on a form, not in his own head at 2 in the morning. I was 45. He looked like a man who had been built for hard weather and then left out in it. Broad through the shoulders, thick through the forearms, the kind of strength that came from lifting real things and not from admiring himself doing it. His hair had gone shaggy and dark, pushed back off his forehead by wind and by his own hand, silver just starting at the temples like frost on a window edge. He kept his beard short and squared off at the jaw. The one part of himself he still maintained on a schedule, because a man who lets that go stops getting hired. He wore a black and red plaid flannel buttoned to the throat in cold months, and a rust-orange leather jacket that had been good once 20 years and one lifetime ago, and now had a split at the left elbow he'd stitched with fishing line. Men at the co-op thought he was quiet. Some thought he was slow. A few of the older ones, the ones who'd had brothers who came back wrong from somewhere, looked at him and understood that quiet was not the same as empty and left him alone in a way that was almost tender. None of them knew about the compartment. Nolan woke at 3:40 that morning with his right hand closed around nothing. It happened the same way every time. His body woke before his mind, chest locked, throat shut, right arm out in front of him, fingers clamped on air, gripping so hard the tendons went white. Because somewhere under the floor of his brain, a gloved hand was sliding out of his slow, wet 1 inch at a time, and no matter how many years passed, his body still believed it could hold on if it just squeezed harder. He couldn't breathe. He never could the first 10 seconds. Then the weight came against his ribs. Rook did not bark. Rook never barked for this. He simply rose in the cramped space between the wheel well and the folded blanket, stepped over the duffel bag without knocking anything, and pressed the whole broad, warm side of his shoulder into Nolan's rib cage and stayed there. Not a nudge. Pressure. Steady, unmoving, unhurried pressure, the way you'd hold a door shut against wind. Nolan's chest hitched, then hitched again, then opened. "Yeah," he said, into the dark voice like a rope dragged over stone. "Yeah, I'm here." Rook was unimpressed by this information. He always was. He waited until Nolan's breathing stopped arguing with itself, and then he laid his head down across Nolan's forearm with a small grunt of complaint about the hour and went back to sleep. Nolan lay awake until the gulls started. I didn't cry. He hadn't in 9 years. But he lay there with his hand buried in that brown, gold, and black coat, feeling the ribs go up and down under his palm, and he thought, as he did most nights, that if a man's whole life came down to the one thing that would notice if he stopped breathing, Then his was a 6-year-old dog with a notched left ear and a chest harness with rook stitched on the side in thread that had faded from black to charcoal. That was the arithmetic. He'd stopped fighting it. She found him at 6:15 with his arms in a tote of bait ice. He heard her before he saw her because everyone at the co-op stopped pretending to work at the same time, which was the loudest thing a working dock ever does. Nolan straightened water running off his forearms and looked toward the loading door. The woman standing in it did not belong. Not in a rude way. She wasn't gawking. She wasn't holding her coat closed against the smell. She just stood there with the particular stillness of a person who has already decided she's staying until she gets what she came for. Gray wool coat, flat shoes going wet at the toes, a leather satchel held against her hip with both hands. "Nolan Briggs," she said, "depends. On what? On whether you're collecting." Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile, an acknowledgement. "I'm not collecting. My name is Iris Calloway. I'm an estate attorney out of Portland. I've been trying to reach you for 5 weeks." That's a long time to be wrong about a phone number. It wasn't wrong, it was disconnected. Twice, she let that sit exactly as long as it needed to and no longer which he noticed. "I'm here about Abel Briggs." Nolan's hands went still in the ice. He had not heard that name spoken aloud by another human being in more than 20 years. It had lived in his family the way a nail lives in a board driven in so long ago that the wood had grown around it, and you only found it when you tried to cut through. "Your uncle chose a rock over his own blood," his mother used to say, at the kitchen table in the voice she saved for it. "Some people call that independence. I call it what it was." "He's dead," Nolan said. "Yes, 11 years ago." "Then I don't see what there is to say." "His estate never cleared," Iris said. "Your father was named first, then your mother. Both passed before the probate closed. The claim moves to you." Behind Nolan, somebody dropped a crate lid and about 4 men very carefully did not laugh. "What claim?" Nolan said. And there, right there, she hesitated. Half a second, nothing. But Nolan had spent 11 years reading men's faces through dive masks in bad light where a flinch meant something, and he saw it. "It's an island," she said, 8 miles out. "Rack line." The laugh finally got out of somebody. "That pile," a voice said from the ice room, "that's a rock with opinions." Nolan didn't turn around. Iris kept going evenly. 41 acres, a cabin, a collapsed dock, a decommissioned light. There's a granite quarry on the eastern side abandoned since 1949, and the tunnels flood on the tide, which means the state has it flagged as a hazard site. There are back taxes, there's an environmental assessment that's 8 years overdue, and there is no fresh water. So it's worthless. "It is a liability," she said. That's the same sentence in a suit. This time she did almost smile. Rook had come up out of the ice room and taken his position at Nolan's left knee, not growling, not stiff, simply there, angled a few degrees so that his body sat between Nolan and the stranger. Iris looked down at him, and then she did something that mattered more than she probably knew. She took one step back to give him room and waited for him to settle before she spoke again. "Mr. Briggs," she said, "there's a letter." He read it standing up with wet hands, which was how he read everything. It was a photocopy. The original, she said, was in a fire-rated box in her office and would stay there. The ink had gone brown, and the handwriting was narrow and hard, slanting forward like it was walking into wind. At the top it said, "Nolan. Not to my heir, not to whom it may concern." His name written by a man he had met exactly once at 7 years old at a funeral where the man had shaken his hand like an adult's and said nothing else, and left before the food came out. Most of it was ordinary. Apologies with no explanation attached to them. A line about his mother that was careful in a way that suggested the writer knew he had no right to say more. A sentence about how the sea only gives back what men are brave enough to ask for, which Nolan read twice and decided was the kind of thing lonely people write. And then at the bottom, in ink pressed darker than the rest, so hard the pen had furrowed the paper, "Do not sell before the third low tide. Under the stone, there is something I have been keeping for 40 years, and I could not lift it alone." Nolan read it, then he read it again. The dock noise went far away. Not gone, just moved back the way sound does when you go under. For 9 years, his life had been numbers, debt totals, interest rates, days since a full night's sleep, the dollar figure on a copay he couldn't cover. Numbers had a way of shrinking a man until he fit inside them. This was not a number. This was an order. From a dead man everybody in his family had called a coward addressed to him by name, and it did not ask. Rook leaned forward and put one front paw down flat on the toe of Nolan's boot. Iris watched it happen. She didn't say anything about it. He liked her for that more than he was ready to admit. "I need money, Ms. Calloway," he said, "not a rock with a lien on it." "I assumed. So I sell it." "You can." "Then why the trip?" Iris shifted her satchel to her other hand. "Because 2 weeks ago, before you were located, before probate cleared, before anyone had legal standing to sell a company, contacted my office asking whether the estate could be purchased in advance of the heir's inspection." Nolan looked up from the letter. "Who?" he said. "Thorn Atlantic Seafood." The name meant nothing to him. It was just 3 words in the wrong order in a wet building that smelled like ice and diesel. But Rook's paw stayed on his boot, and it pressed down, and it did not lift. The boat was old, and the man running it was older, and neither of them apologized for it. Hank Pelletier was 68 and shaped like a fire hydrant that had learned French. Yellow slicker, gray knit cap pulled low even though the morning had gone mild. He looked Nolan over once as he came aboard, took in the jacket, in the boots, in the duffel, and delivered his verdict. "You're Abel's. I'm nobody's." "Sure," Hank said. "That's what he used to say." Nolan set the duffel down. Everything he owned that mattered was in it. 2 shirts, a shaving kit, rolled socks, a folded photograph he had not opened in 4 years of 5 men, on a deck of whom 3 were alive. A charging cable he'd repaired twice with electrical tape. That morning he'd taken the hospital letters out of the glove box and looked at them and put them back. He'd told himself it was because they'd get wet. Rook went to the bow without being told and stood into the wind. "He always do that," Hank said. "He likes to see it coming." "Smart animal. Smarter than me." "Well," said Hank, casting off. "That's a low bar you've set for yourself there, so let's not celebrate." Nolan surprised himself by almost laughing. The harbor pulled back. The co-op became a low roof. The van became a small gray thing among other small gray things, and Nolan looked at it for longer than he meant to, because that was the shape of the last 9 years of his life, and he could cover it with his thumb. 20 minutes out. Hank spoke again without turning around. "You want the version where I'm polite," he said, "or the one where I tell you the truth?" "Truth. Your uncle was the loneliest man I ever met, and I've buried 3 brothers." Hank adjusted the throttle. "And he wasn't crazy. Not one day of it. Everybody said he was, and he let them, and that's the part I've never gotten right in my head. Man doesn't let people call him crazy for 40 years, unless being called crazy is cheaper than the alternative." Nolan watched the water. "Cheaper than what?" Hank didn't answer for a while. "That," he said finally, "is what I've been asking since 1983. The island didn't rise out of the water so much as resolve out of it." Nolan had expected to feel nothing. He had prepared for nothing. He had rehearsed the drive back to Rockhaven with a signed contract in his coat, in a motel room at the end of it, a door that locked a shower without a coin slot, sheets that had been washed by a machine that wasn't him. What he felt instead was the old pressure behind his sternum, the one that came before a dive. Recognition, that was the word, and it made no sense because he had never been here. Rook felt it first. Of course he did. 12 minutes out, the dog's ears came forward and locked, and his body went from standing to aimed, and he did not bark and did not whine and did not shift his weight for the rest of the crossing. He simply stared at the eastern end of the island the way a working dog stares at a scent cone. "Huh," Hank said. "What?" "Nothing." Hank scratched his beard. "Just that's the quarry side he's looking at. That's all. That's the side nobody looks at." The cabin door stuck. Hank hit it with a shoulder and swore at it in 2 languages, and it gave with a groan, and the air that came out was dust and cedar and old paper and 40 years of a man breathing alone. Nolan stood in it for a moment before he went in. Inside, everything was arranged. That was the thing that got him. He'd braced for squalor, the hoarding of the jars of urine, the newspaper stacks, whatever the family stories had trained him to expect from the crazy one. Instead, there was a narrow bed tightly made 11 years ago and never unmade. A wood stove swept, a table under the window, and shelves. The shelves held notebooks, dozens of them, maybe 100. Nolan opened one at random. Tide heights, wind direction, barometric pressure, Moon phase, date, time, column after column in that same forward-leaning hand day after day, year after year, with an occasional note in the margin. No access water too high, try turn back. He opened another. Same, he opened a third, and it was maps the island drawn by hand from above with the eastern quarry sketched in careful detail, and lines penciled across the tunnel mouths showing where the water reached at different tides. Some lines were labeled with dates. One tunnel was circled and circled again until the paper had gone soft. He tracked the water, Nolan said. Hank was in the doorway with his cap in his hands. Every day for 40 years. Why'd ask him? He's dead. Then read faster. Rook was working the floor, nose down, methodical, quartering the room the way he'd been taught, in a life neither of them talked about anymore. He checked the stove, the bed frame, the table legs, and then he stopped at the lowest shelf and pushed his nose hard into a bundle wrapped in oilcloth and looked back over his shoulder. Nolan crouched. Inside the oilcloth was a brass barometer, the old kind, mounted on a wooden back. The glass was cracked straight across. The needle had seized and did not move when he tipped it, and it was stuck hard over on the left side of the dial on the word storm. Nolan turned it over in his hands. It was heavy. It was ruined. It was worth nothing. Rook sat down beside him and stared at it like it had made a sound. The photograph was behind a 1981 calendar. He found it because the calendar had curled, and he flattened it out of pure reflex, the way you square a picture frame in someone else's house. And there was a second frame underneath, glass cracked corner to corner. Two men on a pier squinting into sun. The one on the left was young and narrow-shouldered with dark hair and grease to the elbows, and Nolan knew the jaw because blood carries architecture forward, whether anybody wants it to or not. Abel, 20-something, not a ghost, not a warning, not a story his mother told to explain why men leave. Just a kid, standing next to a boat. The other man was taller, older, dressed like crew, but standing like an officer, one hand on the rail. Nolan turned the frame over. The backing was loose. He worked it out with a thumbnail, and on the back of the photograph in that same hard slanted hand, T. Wren, Providence, Ann, November 1947, and under it pressed harder. Not everyone who disappears means to vanish. The cabin got smaller around him. It wasn't shock. Shock is fast. This was slow, a door being pushed open from the other side by something patient that had been waiting behind it a long time. Hank. Yeah. You ever hear of a boat called the Providence Ann? Hank Pelletier had been leaning in the doorway. He stopped leaning. He came over and took the photograph without asking and held it up to the window light and stood there for so long that Nolan heard the surf change. My father, Hank said, was 14 years old in November of 1947, and he stood on the Rockhaven Town Pier at 6 in the morning with about 100 other people waiting for a boat that never came in. He handed the photograph back. His hand was not steady. 31 aboard, cannery workers. Went down in a nor'easter, they said. Never found her. Never found one of them. Never found one. Not a body, not a hatch cover, not a boot. Hank's jaw worked. Which, if you know, this coast is the part that is supposed to bother you. Nolan looked at the photograph again, at the young man with grease on his hands who had lived on this rock for 40 years, writing down what the water did every single day. He knew where she was, Nolan said. Hank didn't answer. He put his cap back on, which Nolan would come to learn was what he did instead of answering. Rook barked. One sound. Sharp, short, cut off, clean, and it came from outside, and it was not the sound of a dog barking at a gull. Nolan was moving before he'd decided to. He came out of the cabin, and Rook was already 50 yards east, standing in the salt grass with his body low and his weight forward, and he was not looking back to see if Nolan was coming, which meant he was working. Rook, hold. The dog held. Everything in him objected. Nolan could see the tremor running down the hind legs, but he held. Nolan came up beside him. Below them, the ground broke apart into the quarry. Black granite cut in steps by men who'd been dead a lifetime, dropping down toward the water in ledges slick with weed. And at the bottom where the sea came in through a channel, there was a seam in the rock where the water went in and did not come back out at the same rate. Rook barked 3 times, short, even, spaced. Nolan knew that bark. He had spent 4 years of his life knowing that bark. It wasn't excitement and it wasn't fear. It was a report. What's he saying? Hank had come up behind them, breathing hard. He's saying there's something in there. Something like what? He doesn't do what, Nolan said. He does here. I went down, 2 ledges no farther. He wasn't stupid. The granite was black glass with weed on it and stopped where the dry rock ended, and the smell came up at him on the outbreath of the tunnel. Salt, weed, cold stone, and under it faint wrong unmistakable old oil and iron and trapped air. Air that had not been outside in a very long time. His chest tightened, and for one bad second, his body tried to take him somewhere else. A flooded compartment, red light static, a glove sliding, and he shut it down hard with the training, the way you slam a hatch. "What's the tide doing?" he said. Hank checked the water, then the sky, then the rock, which was apparently the real clock. "Coming up. You missed the bottom by half an hour. When's the next one lower?" "Tomorrow. Then the day after's lower still." Hank's eyes narrowed. "Third one down is the big one. But Briggs, I've had men ask me about that quarry twice in 50 years, and I buried both of them." Nolan looked at the seam in the rock. "Do not sell before the third low tide." "He stood here," Hank said quieter. "Abel, right about where your dog's sitting. I used to come out here as a young fool and watch him do it, and I thought he was waiting on ghosts. And now," Hank looked at the water going into the black seam. "Now I'm old enough to know ghosts are mostly just truths nobody buried right." The white boat came at 4 in the afternoon, and it did not belong to anyone who had ever worked for a living. Nolan watched it come. Chrome, a hull that cut water instead of arguing with it, an engine that purred where Hanks coughed. "Well," Hank said, "that was fast. You know it. I know the type." The man who came up the path was in his 60s and moved like the ground had been informed of his arrival. Silver hair brushed back and holding. A navy wool coat that was casual the way expensive things pretend to be casual. Boat shoes without a mark of mud on them, which on this island took either a helicopter or a miracle. On his right hand, a heavy signet ring caught the light, anchor and seabird. "Mr. Briggs," he called from a polite distance. "Whitaker Thorne, I hope I'm not intruding." "That usually means he knows he is," Hank said. Thorne's smile warmed by exactly 1 degree. "Henri Pelletier, still narrating the coastline. Still watching you people buy it." Thorne turned to Nolan, and here was the thing Nolan noticed immediately and did not like the man, did not look at the cabin or the quarry or the boat. He looked at Nolan's jacket, the split at the elbow, the stitched fishing line. He looked at it for less than a second, and then he looked away, and his face arranged itself into something warm. "I'll be direct," Thorne said. "My family's company has held water rights and processing facilities on this coast for 4 generations. Rackline sits inside our operating zone. We've wanted it for a long time, and frankly, your uncle would not sell to us at any price for reasons I never understood." "Reasons," Nolan said. He was a solitary man. "That's not a reason, that's a description." Thorne inclined his head, conceding the point graciously, which Nolan understood was a technique. "Mr. Briggs, I'm not going to pretend I don't know your circumstances. Ms. Calloway is a fine attorney, and she will have told you what this property costs to hold. Taxes. The hazard designation on that quarry alone. The state will come for that eventually, and when they do, the remediation order lands on you personally." Rook came off the cabin step. He did not run. He walked unhurried, and he placed himself between Nolan's left leg and Whitaker Thorne, and he stopped there and looked up at the man with the flat, unblinking attention of a judge who has already read the sealed file. He did not growl. That was worse. Thorne looked down at him. "Beautiful animal. He's not real big on compliments." Intelligent creatures rarely are. Thorne's hand had started toward his coat pocket. He saw Rook's ears move a 1/4 inch, and he lowered it again slowly and did not put it back up. "I'd like to make you an offer. Today, in writing, my company assumes the taxes, the hazard remediation, the environmental filings, all of it." "How much?" Thorne said the number. Nolan didn't move. He'd spent enough years learning not to move. But it hit him like heat off an opened oven because it was not a good number. It was a finished number. It cleared the hospital. It cleared the collections. It bought a year of rent in a truck that started, in a door that locked, and it left enough over that for the first time since he was 36, he would not have to do arithmetic in the grocery aisle. Thorne watched him not move and read him anyway. "There'd be a relocation allowance as well," he added gently. And if you need medical referrals, I know several people who work with veterans. Quietly, no forms. That last part was the tell. No forms. A man doesn't offer to route you around the paperwork unless paperwork is the thing he's most afraid of. I'll think about it, Nolan said. Of course. Thorne set the envelope on the porch rail rather than handing it to him, which was its own small piece of technique. There's no pressure. I'd only say rackline can be very dangerous to people who don't understand it. That quarry has taken men before. There was nothing threatening in the sentence. That was exactly why Nolan heard it. Hank went back to the mainland at dusk, swearing he'd return in the morning, unless the weather developed a personality. Iris had arranged a cot, bottled water, a lantern, canned food. Nolan told himself he was staying to inspect the property. He wasn't inspecting anything. He sat at Abel's table with the lantern going, and he put two pieces of paper down in front of him. The letter on the left, the offer on the right. One from a dead man asking for 3 days. One from a living man offering the rest of his life back. Nolan sat there a long time. I thought about the van. He thought about the sound the co-op ice machine made at 4 in the morning and how he'd learned to sleep through it. He thought about the fact that he was 45 years old and everything he owned fit in one bag, and that a man could get tired enough to sell anything. Land memory warnings questions the last instruction a dying relative ever wrote down. He reached for the offer. Rook stood up. He crossed the cabin floor in 4 strides, and he put one front paw down flat on the contract, and he did not move it. Rook, the dog held his eyes. That's rent, Nolan said. His voice came out rougher than he meant. That's a door, buddy. You understand? That's a door that locks. Rook did not understand and did not care and did not move. Nolan sat back. He looked at the paw. He looked at the fur on that leg, brown gold going into black at the shoulder, at the harness, lying on the floor by the stove with Rook stitched into it in thread, gone soft with age, and he thought about a night 9 years ago in a flooded compartment where a man's hand had gone out of his, and how the last thing he'd heard was his own name once, not angry, not begging. Just his name. Nolan. He'd let go. He'd had to let go, and 3 men had lived because of it, and he had never once been able to say that sentence out loud in the right order. Rook leaned into his leg. Nolan let out a breath that had been in him for about 9 years. Okay, he said. He picked up the offer, folded it in half, and slid it under the cracked barometer where the needle sat frozen on storm. Not thrown out, not signed, pinned. Then he took Abel's letter and read the last line one more time, and outside the wind came off the water and pushed against the cabin, and the whole building made a low sound in its frame like something old turning over in its sleep. I could not lift it alone. 3 tides, Nolan said. Rook lay down with his muzzle across the toe of Nolan's boot and closed his eyes as though this had been obvious from the beginning and he had simply been waiting for the human to catch up. Nolan sat in the lantern light with his hand in that coat and listened to the sea move in and out of a hole in the rock where a boat with 31 people on it had been sitting in the dark since 1947, waiting for somebody to come down and ask it a question. For the first time in 9 years, he didn't feel like he was running from water. He felt like he'd finally found a piece of it that wanted him to come in. The first low tide came at 5:52 in the morning, and Nolan was awake for all of it. I didn't go down. That was the discipline talking, and the discipline it had kept him alive in worse places than a main quarry. You don't enter unknown water on the first look. You watch it. You learn what it does when nobody's asking anything of it. So he sat on the ledge above the seam, with coffee going cold in a tin cup and Rook lying against his hip, and he counted. 22 minutes of drop. Then a pause where the water didn't seem to move at all. Then the return faster than the drop, which told him the channel narrowed somewhere inside. That's a bad shape, he said out loud. Rook lifted his head. Water goes out slow and comes back fast. That means it's squeezing through something. Means the way in isn't the same size as the way out. Rook put his head back down. He had heard a great deal of technical commentary in his life and had formed no strong opinions on any of it. By 7, Hank's boat was coming in, with Iris Calloway aboard, and a woman Nolan hadn't seen before standing beside her at the rail, holding a canvas case against her chest with both arms like it was a sleeping child. Nolan came down to the dock. I didn't ask for company, he said. You didn't ask for anything, Iris said, stepping off. That's been the problem. Nolan Briggs, Naomi Castellan. She works with disappearance records. Labor cases mostly. People who got moved and then unmoved. Naomi was somewhere past 50, with black hair going silver and tied low, and she did not look at Nolan first. She looked at Rook. She crouched and she let him come to her, and she waited through the entire slow business of a working dog making up his mind about a stranger. "He's the one who found it," she said. "He found the smell of it." "That's the same thing." Naomi stood brushing her hands. "That's always been the same thing. Somebody smells it before anybody proves it." Nolan looked at Iris. "You brought a historian." "I brought an archivist. There's a difference and you'll learn it by lunch." Iris was already walking up the path. "I also brought a scanner, a hard drive, 400 archival, sleeves, and news. You want the news standing up or sitting down?" "Standing." Thorne Atlantic filed an intent to purchase with the county yesterday afternoon. 4 p.m., which means their attorney drafted it before Whitaker Thorne ever set foot on this island. Nolan stopped walking. "He came out here with the paperwork already filed." "He came out here to watch your face while you read the number," Iris said. "The filing was done. He wasn't negotiating. He was confirming." The cabin turned into a paper war by 9. Iris set up on the table and made rules within 90 seconds of arriving. Nothing gets touched without gloves. Nothing gets moved without a photograph. First, nothing leaves the building. Hank complained about all three and obeyed all three. Naomi took the shelf of notebooks and worked through them the way a person reads a diary they've been given permission to read and still feels wrong about. By 10, she had found the pattern. "I wasn't tracking tides," she said. Iris looked up. "He recorded tides for 40 years. He recorded tides for 40 years, the way a man watching one door records everybody who walks past it." Naomi turned the notebook around. "Look at the margins. No access. No access. Too high. Try turn back. He isn't logging the ocean. He's logging his own failures to get into one specific place." Nolan came over. "How many attempts?" Naomi ran a finger down a column, then flipped and did it again, and something went out of her face. "I've counted 611 so far," she said, "and I'm in 1974. Nobody said anything. Hank sat down heavily on the bed frame. 600, he said, "so far." 600 times he came out to that rock and looked at the water and wrote down no. Hank took his cap off. He put it back on. "And every single one of those days, I was 8 miles away telling people he'd lost his mind." Nolan went down on the second tide. He went alone, and he did it right. Guideline anchored to a granite spur, tested twice with his full weight. Compact cylinder. Backup light. Knife on the harness where he could reach it left-handed. He stripped the leather jacket and left it folded on the dry rock with the flannel on top because a man doesn't dive in what he loves, and he'd had that jacket since before any of it. Hank held the line. Iris held the timer. Naomi held the dog. Rook did not take it well. He sat because he'd been told to sit, and every muscle in him filed a formal objection about it. Chest forward weight on the front paws, the notched ears swiveling toward the seam and back to Nolan and to the seam again. Nolan crouched in front of him and took his head in both hands. "You mark the outside," he said. "I go in. That's the jump. That's always been the jump." Rook stared at him with such open offense that Hank had to turn away. "He's not agreeing," Naomi said. "He never agrees. He complies. There's a difference, and he wants me to know it." Nolan clipped in and went down. The cold took him at the waist and then the chest, and it was personal every time. The way it always is, that first squeeze that makes a man's body remember. It is a bag of warm water in a world that isn't. He set his mask, put the light on, and went in. 12 feet and the sound changed. Outside, the sea was wide. Inside, it became a throat. Every drip came back 3 times. His own breathing came back at him off wet granite, and the walls were tool-cut, straight. Square men had done this with drills and black powder in 1911, and then walked away in 1949 and left the sea to move in. He worked slow. 3 steps, stop, check ceiling. 2 steps, test footing. The old part of him came back without asking permission, and it was not the haunted part. It was the trained part. The part that could count seconds against a rising tide and read black water like an alphabet he'd paid a great deal to learn. At 40 feet, the quarry tunnel bent left and stopped being a tunnel. The rock had failed at some point. A wall between the cut and a natural sea cave had collapsed or been collapsed, and the 2 spaces had become one space. And in that space, wedged between 2 shelves of granite at an angle that made no sense until you understood the tide had put it there, Over months was the hull of a boat. Nolan stopped moving entirely. It was maybe 70 feet. Wood iron fastened, the planking blistered black and furred with growth. The bow was crushed inward on the port side, folded like a beer can, and a section of gunwale hung down into the water. There were mooring cleats. There was a hatch frame with the hatch gone. She had not sunk here. She had been carried in and jammed and sealed and left, and the ocean had spent 79 years quietly deciding whether to keep her. Nolan put two gloved fingers on the hull. Providence Answarm, he said into his own mask to nobody. Then he swept the light down the side and found the letters. Not the name was long gone, but a stenciled hull number under the weed, and beneath that low on the planking, near the waterline, a hole. A clean hole. Round. Board not broken, and 6 feet from it, another one. Nolan hung in the water and looked at those two holes for longer than his air budget allowed. Rocks don't drill. Sorry. He came out of the seam on his hands and knees, and Rook broke his stay. Not far, the dog got 4 feet and slammed his own brakes, quivering, having remembered mid-motion that he'd been given an order. But he came the rest of the way when Nolan sat up, and he pressed his forehead into Nolan's chest so hard that Nolan went back on one elbow, and he stayed there. All right, Nolan said, hoarse. All right, I'm out. Hank was already hauling the line in. You were down 38. I know. You said 25. I know. Iris crouched next to him. Nolan, what's in there? He got his breath back. He wiped salt off his face with his forearm, and he looked up at 3 people standing over him in bad wind, and he thought about how to say it, and there wasn't a good way. She's in there, he said. The boat. She's whole enough to name. Naomi's hand went to her mouth. And somebody put 2 holes in her hull below the waterline, Nolan said. Bored. Even. 6 feet apart. Same height. Same diameter. That's not a rock. That's not a storm. Hank Pelletier stood very still. Say the rest of it, he said. You already know the rest of it. Say it anyway. Nolan got to his feet. Somebody scuttled her, with 31 people aboard, and then they towed her into a hole in the rock where nobody was ever going to look, because the only people who'd look were the families, and the families were the ones on the boat. Hank turned around and walked 10 feet down the ledge and stood with his back to all of them, and nobody followed him, and after a while he came back with his eyes red and his voice completely level. My father waited on that pier until dark, he said. They told him it was weather. The third tide was the one Abel had written about, and it came the next morning, and it was the lowest water any of them had seen. Nolan went in with a cutting tool, a dry bag, and a plan he'd built on paper at 2 in the morning with Naomi holding the lantern. The plan was simple, and it was ugly. Working boats of that era carried the ship's papers, the crew list, and the payroll in a strong box in the master's cabin or on a company boat in a fixed locker aft of the engine housing where the owner's man could get at it and the crew couldn't. Naomi had said it 3 times to make sure he heard it. If there is a list, it will not be in an obvious place, because whoever kept it knew what it was worth. He found the locker in 11 minutes. It was where she said it would be, and it was ruined, and it was empty. He hung there in the dark with his light on an empty steel box and felt something in him go flat. And then he turned around and 8 feet behind him, bolted to a frame member on the inside of the hull, in a place no shipwright would ever put a fixture, was a second box. Not factory, not original. It had been mounted there by hand. The bolts were the wrong pattern. The bracket was cut from something else. And somebody had wrapped the whole assembly in tarred canvas that had held for 79 years. Because a man who does a thing while terrified does it very, very well. Nolan put his hand on it. It was small, 11 inches maybe, and it had been welded shut along the seam by an amateur and scratched into the lid deep with something sharp, and in a hurry were 2 letters and a word. T. Wren names. Shaw. He surfaced with the box in the dry bag against his chest, and he could barely get up the ledge. Naomi didn't wait for him to stand. She went down on the wet rock in her good coat and put her hands on the bag and looked up at him, and her face was doing something complicated. Is it sealed? Welded. By who? By somebody who didn't have time to do it pretty. They got it into the cabin, and Iris photographed it from 6 angles before anybody touched a tool to it, and then Hank cut the seam with a hacksaw because Hank was the only one whose hands weren't shaking. Inside there were 3 things. A leather-bound notebook swollen at the spine but dry because the canvas and the weld had done exactly what a frightened man had prayed they'd do. A packet of company documents, folded in wax paper, Labor contracts, all of them printed in English, signed with X marks and thumbprints. And a cloth bag heavy, which Hank opened and then set down fast. Silver. Payroll silver and wrapped bars stamped. Nobody looked at it twice, because Naomi had opened the notebook and gone completely silent, and when Nolan came around behind her, he saw why. It was a list. 31 entries, handwritten, and whoever had written it had not written it the way a company writes a manifest. There were names, there were ages, and beside a great many of them in smaller script, squeezed into the margin, there were other names: mother, wife, brother, the two boys. The two boys, someone's daughter in Lisbon, someone's sister in Halifax. Whoever wrote this had known they were going to become cargo, and they had refused to let it happen cleanly. Naomi turned a page and stopped again. Ines Duarte, she read, 8 years old. Iris looked up sharply. There was a child aboard. There were 4, Naomi said. Her voice had gone very careful. 4 under 12, which the 1947 casualty report does not mention because the 1947 casualty report lists 31 workers. Nobody said anything for a while. Hank was standing by the stove with his cap in both hands, and he was not looking at any of them. Say the number again, he said. 4. There were 4 kids on that boat, and this town has had a memorial plaque on the pier since 1962, and it says 31 fishermen lost. He put the cap on, took it off. 31 fishermen. Sighing. Tobias Wren's notebook was the thing that changed the shape of the room. He'd been the mate, not the captain, the mate, which Naomi said mattered, because the mate saw the cargo and the crew and the paperwork and had no authority over any of it. The early pages were ordinary: weather, engine trouble, a complaint about a bilge pump. Then in September of 1947, the tone shifted, and it shifted the way a man's voice shifts when he starts to understand what he's been part of. Certain workers came aboard at night from a second pier. They came with contracts they could not read. The contracts assigned housing, food, transport, and equipment against wages, and Wren had done the arithmetic in the margin twice, and both times the arithmetic came out the same way: nobody had ever finished paying. Not one man. In 19 years, not one man had worked his way out. They weren't employees, they were held. Wren had gone to the company. Wren had been told to stay in his lane. Wren had gone a second time and had been transferred to a boat with a worse route, and then transferred back, which he wrote down as a warning, wearing a promotion. And then Wren had talked to a mechanic named Abel Briggs, because Abel worked the company's engines, and Abel noticed things the officers didn't. Fuel that didn't match the run, cereal plates that had been ground and re-stamped, a tender that made a crossing at Euro 300 with nothing on the log. Nolan read that page 3 times. Abel was 22 years old, he thought. He was 22 and somebody handed him this. Naomi read the last entries out loud because nobody else could. Wren had written that he was making copies, that he was putting one set somewhere the company could not reach, that if the boat went down, if he'd written in October, 6 weeks before it did, Abel would know where to look when the tide opened the quarry. And the final line in a hand that had gone unsteady: these names must outlive us. That is the whole of it. Everything else is weather. The boat came at 3 in the afternoon, and it was not Thorns. It was modest, blue-hulled, and the man who came up the path had a satchel under one arm and was fighting the wind for his hat and losing badly. Rook was off the step before Nolan was out the door. "That's far enough," Nolan called. The man stopped instantly 20 yards out and raised both hands, palms open, and did not come any closer, which was the first sensible thing anybody had done on this island all week. "Mr. Briggs, my name is Peter Lachlan. I'm a maritime archaeologist. I apologize completely for arriving unannounced. I know exactly what this looks like." "Do you?" "Some academic turns up the same week the past coughs something up." He was still holding his hands out. "Yes, I'm aware." "At least he knows," Hank said from behind Nolan. Lachlan was in his 40s, thin in a field vest with too many pockets, round glasses sliding down his nose, and shoes that were being destroyed by the island in real time. He had ink on 2 fingers. Iris came out. "How did you find this?" "A colleague of mine monitors registry inquiries. Somebody pulled the 1947 Rockhaven casualty file out of the state archive on Tuesday, and that file has been touched twice since 1963. He pushed his glasses up. "I was in Bar Harbor. I thought time might matter more than manners." Iris's face didn't change, but Nolan saw her recalculate. "I pulled that file," she said, "under seal." Seals don't stop the access log, Lachlan said. Only the contents. Nolan looked at him for a long moment. Rook had not moved. He wasn't growling. He'd simply put his body between the man and the cabin door and set his weight, and he stayed like that. And Lachlan noticed and did not try to walk around him. Come in, Nolan said. Hands where people can see them. Reasonable, said Lachlan. He earned his place inside in about 40 minutes, which was the problem. He didn't touch anything. He asked before he looked. He read Wren's notebook upside down across the table until Iris got tired of watching him strain and turned it around for him, and then he went quiet in a way that was not performance. This is a mate's hand, he said. You can tell by the shorthand on the engine entries. Officers wrote for inspection, mates wrote for themselves. You've seen his writing before. No, but I know the type of document, and this is a rare one, and I want you to understand why. He took his glasses off. Ships that went down with people who mattered generated inquiries. Ships that went down with people who didn't generated insurance claims. That's the whole difference, and it's brutal, and it's the entire architecture of what you're holding. He started pulling threads, and he pulled them fast. The company letterhead on the labor contracts wasn't Thorn Atlantic. It was Thorn and Hollis Fisheries. Lachlan recognized it in under 10 seconds and explained why T&H had dissolved in 1951 and reformed in 1953 as Thorn Atlantic Seafood with the same wharf, the same fleet, the same family, and a clean corporate birthday. That's not unusual, Iris said. Companies restructure. Companies restructure. Companies do not restructure 4 years after losing an uninsured vessel and then file retroactive hull coverage. Lachlan tapped a page. Look at this. That's an endorsement date. That policy was written in 1949 and backdated to cover a loss in 1947. Iris went very still. That's fraud. That's provable fraud, Lachlan said. The other thing is a war crime with a shipping schedule and good luck. But this is a form somebody filled out wrong 77 years ago. Nolan watched him say it and thought he's good. He's very good. And underneath that, quieter, he's too good, and he got here too fast, and he knew the corporate history before he asked a single question about it. Mia. Naomi worked through the night on the names. Nolan came in around 2 and found her at the table with her blue notebook open beside the list, copying each entry by hand, one at a time in careful print. They're already on the page, he said. They're on that page. She didn't look up. That page was written by a man about to die, and it lived in a metal box underwater for 79 years, and it is the only thing in this world that says these people existed as people. She finished a line. The first time a name gets copied out with care, it stops being cargo. That's not sentiment. That's the actual mechanism. I've watched it work in 11 countries. Nolan sat down across from her. How many can you find? Family some, maybe a third if the spellings hold. She turned the notebook toward him. Duarte, for instance. There's a Duarte line that shows up in Gloucester in 1951 and again in New Bedford, and if the H was dropped the way I think it was, I've got a live thread. Live thread meaning what? Naomi took her glasses off. Meaning somebody alive today has been telling a story at a kitchen table for 70 years about a relative who went to America and stopped writing, she said. And they've spent their whole lives quietly believing he stopped writing because he didn't care. Nolan looked at the list. He thought about his mother at her kitchen table. Some people call that independence. Yeah, he said, I know that story. The call came at 9:15 the next morning, and Iris put it on speaker because she was already reaching for a pen. Mr. Briggs, Whitaker Thorne's voice came through warm and unhurried. I hope I'm not interrupting your inspection. Depends what you're calling about. I spoke with my board last night. We're prepared to revise. He said the new number. It was 40% higher than the first one, and the cabin heard it. Hank's head came up. Even Naomi stopped writing. Nolan said nothing. I'd also like to say something, and I hope you'll take it in the spirit it's offered. Thorne went on. That quarry is unstable. The eastern face has come down twice in my lifetime. I understand a man in your position may feel that risk is worth taking, and I want you to know I don't judge that. I judge the people who put you in a position where it seems reasonable. That's generous. It's honest. Mr. Briggs, your uncle spent 40 years on that rock, and it cost him his family, his reputation, and every relationship he had. Your mother died believing he abandoned her. Sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is stop letting the dead give him orders, and it landed. That was the awful part. It landed dead center because a piece of Nolan wanted it to be true. The tired piece, the piece that had been doing arithmetic in grocery aisles for 9 years, the piece that had been 3 seconds from signing. His hand moved toward the table. Rook stood up so fast the floorboard cracked. He didn't go to the box. He came to Nolan, and he put that same paw down on the toe of that same boot, and he pressed. The room waited. Nolan looked down at him. Then he looked at Naomi's blue notebook, opened 31 names in careful print, and at the top of the visible page, Inés Duarte 8. He lifted his hand off the table. "Mr. Thorne," he said, "you told me on my porch that your family's held rights on this coast for 4 generations. That's correct. Then you can tell me the name of a boat you lost in 1947. The silence had edges. It went on 2 seconds, 3, long enough that Iris wrote something down and turned the pad around so Nolan could see it. "Oh, I'd have to look that up," Thorne said. "No, you wouldn't. I'm going to let you go, Mr. Briggs." The warmth was still there. It had simply stopped meaning anything. "Take your time. The offer stands until Friday." The call ended. Iris turned on him. "That was a catastrophic thing to do." "I know. He now knows exactly what we have and how far in you are." "He knew Tuesday," Nolan said. "He filed before he ever came out here. He didn't come to buy an island. He came to find out whether I'd been down that hole yet." And he stood on my porch and looked at my jacket instead of my face because he was pricing me. He put both hands on the table. "So no, he didn't learn anything today. But I did." "What did you learn?" "That a man whose family has run this coast for 100 years had to think about whether he'd lost a boat." Naomi read the last third of Ren's notebook that afternoon, and near the end she stopped and read one line twice and then set it down and stood up and walked to the window. "Naomi, there's an entry from the 11th of November, she said, which is a week after the sinking." Everything in the room stopped. Iris got there first. "That's not possible. That's the same notebook. It was in the hall. It's the same hand. It's the same ink." Naomi's voice was steady, and it cost her. "The last 3 pages were written by Tobias Wren after the Providence Ann went down." Nolan came around the table. The writing was worse cramped, sloped, done fast, and it said that he had gone off at the second pier before she sailed because he'd been ordered off, and that he had watched from the shore road, and that the boat had not gone out into weather at all. She had been taken up the coast under tow. He had walked 12 miles that night. He had found a man on the Rock Haven pier who would take him out, and the man had been 14 years old and hadn't been able to start his father's engine, and Wren had written that down too. The boy tried. Hank Pelletier made a sound. It came out of him like something breaking loose, and he sat down on the bed frame with both hands over his face, and nobody touched him, and nobody said his father's name out loud because it was already in the room. The last line in the notebook was addressed to nobody or to everybody. "I am going back for the box. If they find me first, the mechanic knows the tide." Nolan straightened slowly. "He went back in," he said. "He got a boarder after. That's how the box is welded on the inside. That's how there's a bracket that doesn't match anything." He turned to the door. "He put it there himself, and he never came out, and Abel spent 40 years knowing there was a man in that hull who died mounting a box for him." Naomi closed the notebook with both hands gently the way you close a door on a sleeping room. And across the table in the corner, where he had been silently annotating a manifest for the last hour, Peter Lachlan had gone the color of paper. Nobody noticed but the dog. Rook lifted his head, turned it, and looked directly at Lachlan's face, not at his hands, not at the papers at his face, and held it there, and did not blink. Lachlan set his pen down very carefully as though it had become heavy. "I'm sorry," he said. "I need a minute outside." He went out. The door shut. Hank looked up from his hands, eyes wrecked, and said the only thing anybody said for a full minute. He didn't ask who the mechanic was. They had 51 hours and a shoulder that wouldn't lift above chest height, and Iris Calloway spent the first 90 minutes of it doing the least dramatic thing anybody did in the whole affair. She made phone calls. Nolan sat on the cabin floor with his back against the bed frame, while Naomi cut his sleeve away and cleaned the tear across his deltoid with the contents of a first aid kit that predated the millennium, and he listened to Iris work, and somewhere in the middle of it, he understood that he had been wrong about what a fight looked like. He'd spent 11 years in a job where the fight was the loud part. Iris's fight had no volume at all. It was a woman standing in wind on the east side of an island, reading a permit number out loud to a duty officer in Augusta 4 times slowly because the signal kept dropping and because getting it wrong once would cost them everything. State Marine Resources, she said, coming back in, then the Coast Guard, then the medical examiner's office in Augusta. Hank looked up. Medical examiner, he's been dead since Truman. Doesn't matter. Iris was already opening her laptop. In Maine, human remains discovered in a non-cemetery context trigger a scene. Age is irrelevant. The ME takes jurisdiction, and jurisdiction beats a remediation permit every single time because you cannot legally pour concrete onto an active death investigation. Nolan's head came up. That's it, he said. That's the whole play. That's the whole play. Iris turned the screen toward him. Your permit is a safety instrument. Does the entire legal weight comes from the claim that the site is a hazard with no other competing public interest. The second that void becomes a scene, the permit isn't revoked, it's superseded, automatically, by operation of law. Nobody has to argue it. How long to get a determination? That, Iris said, is the problem. Boom. The problem had a name, and it was Dr. Farah Okonkwo, Deputy Chief Medical Examiner, and she did not believe him, not out of malice. Nolan understood that inside 4 seconds of the call, she believed she was talking to a man on an island who had been in the water that morning, who had a head injury she couldn't rule out, and who was describing skeletal remains in a submerged hull at 40 feet in a tunnel that had partially collapsed while he was inside it. Mr. Briggs, I'm not dismissing you, she said. I'm telling you what I need. I need images. I need something I can put in front of a chief who is going to ask me why I'm putting a team on a rock in a nor'easter window for a 1947 loss. I have images. You have images from a dive camera in silt. I have images from before the collapse, Nolan said. Clear water. I photographed the compartment, the bracket, the position of the remains in a steel plate with initials chiseled into it. It's on a card in my hand right now. There was a pause. Can you get me those in the next 2 hours? Nolan looked at Iris. Iris looked at the signal bar on her phone, which was one, and had been one all morning, and which had failed on 2 consecutive upload attempts. Yes, Nolan said. He hung up and turned to Hank. Rockland, he said. How fast can you make Rockland? In this, Hank was already standing. 2 hours 10 if I don't mind losing the boat. Do you mind losing the boat? Hank Pelletier picked his cap up off the table. My father stood on that pier till dark, he said. No, I don't mind. Naomi went with him because somebody had to carry a hard drive, and because Naomi Castellan had been putting names in front of institutions for 30 years and knew exactly how a person has to stand in a government lobby to not be handed a form. That left 4 of them on the island. Nolan, Iris, Ellis, and the dog. And it left the thing nobody had said out loud since the doc. Iris said it at 4 in the afternoon without preamble, the way she said everything. Ellis, sit down. He sat. You sent your uncle a message Tuesday night. Yes. What was in it word for word? Ellis took his phone out and set it on the table and slid it across unlocked and did not argue about it, which Nolan noted. Iris read it twice. Rec confirmed. Hull substantially intact. Recommend immediate professional survey before further disturbance. She looked up. That's it. That's it. You didn't mention the box. There was no box on the Tuesday. The box came up Wednesday. Ellis's hands were flat on the table. And I didn't send anything after Wednesday. I've sent him nothing since Naomi opened that notebook. Why not? Ellis was quiet for a second. Because on Wednesday, it was a shipwreck, he said. And on Wednesday night, it became a room with a man in it. And I discovered I'm not the person I'd been telling myself I was for 11 years. He looked at Nolan. I'd built this whole architecture where I was the honest thorn, the one who studied it. And it turns out studying a thing for 11 years is a very sophisticated way of never doing anything about it. Nobody spoke. The message bought them the permit, Iris said. Yes. You understand that means a man went into that quarry Tuesday night with a cutting tool because of a sentence you typed. Yes, Ellis said. I've understood that since I saw the rope. Nolan watched him and thought about how easy it would be to hate him and how completely useless. Iris, he said, ask him the real question. Iris didn't take her eyes off Ellis, which is who went down there. Ellis's face did something. Because it wasn't him, Nolan said. Whitaker Thorne is 62 years old with soft hands and boat shoes, and whoever cut that marker did it at 11 feet in a flooding quarry cut in the dark. That's a diver, a real one. And Thorne Atlantic doesn't keep one on payroll to clean hulls, so somebody made a call. Ellis put both hands over his mouth. "Oh, God," he said, "say it." Dane Corliss, Ellis's voice had gone thin. He does hull inspections and mooring work for the company out of Rockland. He's been doing it 20 years. He's Nolan. He's not a criminal. He's a guy with 2 kids who does contract dive work. He cut a line with a man on it. I know what he did. Ellis stood up so fast the chair went over. I'm saying he probably doesn't know what he did. You cut a marker and shift a wedge in a quarry that's already condemned, and somebody tells you it's a liability job, you don't think you've killed anybody. You think you've made a hazard site slightly more hazardous. That's how my family has always done it. Nobody down the chain ever holds the whole thing. Iris was already writing. Then he's the one who talks, she said. Hank called at 6:40 from a parking lot in Rockland, and his voice was wrong. They took the drive, he said. Naomi's still inside, been an hour. That's good, Iris said. An hour means somebody senior came down. That's not why I'm calling. A pause and traffic noise. There's a barge tied up at the commercial wharf. Grout pump on the deck, 2 tugs made fast crew loading dry mix since noon. Another pause. Briggs, she's not sailing Thursday. Nolan closed his eyes. When? They're loading for a night departure. Guy on the dock told me they're pulling at 4 in the morning to catch the tide. Iris did the arithmetic out loud and it came out to 17 hours. In the 72-hour notice, she'd been building an entire legal architecture around turned into paper. They can't, she said. The permit is effective Thursday. Sailing early is... It's staging, Ellis said quietly. They're not pouring early. They're going to be tied off at rackline with a pump primed at 7:01 a.m. Thursday. It's not illegal. It's efficient. Then we don't have 51 hours, Nolan said. We have until 7 Thursday morning and 1 call from a doctor in Augusta who thinks I have a head injury. Naomi called at 8:15 and she was crying, and it took Nolan a full 10 seconds to understand it wasn't bad news. They're coming, she said. Say that again. Okonkwo looked at the photographs for 4 minutes, and then she called her chief at home. Naomi's voice kept going and breaking and going. Nolan, it wasn't the remains that did it. It was the plate, the initials. She said remains in a wreck are ambiguous. Remains in a wreck with a chiseled marker next to them means somebody found this before and didn't report it, and that's not archaeology anymore. That's a person who knew. Iris had her hand over her own mouth when Nolan said, they're staging a dive team out of Southwest Harbor at first light. She wants site preservation until then, and she used the word seen. She said it 3 times. She said, tell the property owner that as of this call, the Eastern Quarry is a scene. Hank came on the line. You hear that Briggs scene? I heard it. So we won. Noti, Nolan said. First light is 5:20. The barge ties off at 7. That's 100 minutes. All we've got is 100 minutes and a piece of paper nobody's holding yet. Iris got the determination in writing at 11:52 p.m., a PDF that took 19 minutes to download on 1 bar of signal, and that she read on a cracked phone screen by lantern light while everybody stood around her not breathing. Then she looked up and said the sentence that broke the room. It's addressed to the wrong permit number. What? The ME's office referenced the state hazard designation number, not the remediation permit. There are different instruments. She was already scrolling. Legally, this is still correct. A scene supersedes regardless. But if a barge master at 7 in the morning is handed a document that doesn't cite the permit he's operating under, he is going to call his office, and his office is going to tell him to proceed pending clarification, and by the time anybody clarifies anything, that hull is full. Hank swore. Can she reissue? Her office opens at 8. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Ellis Thorne stood up. I can stop the barge, he said. Everybody looked at him. Not legally, he said. I can't stop it legally. There's nothing I can do legally. But I know that crew. I've been on that wharf since I was 9 years old. The barge master is a man named Roy Tessier, and he has worked for my family for 31 years, and he taught me to splice line when I was 11. Ellis's hands were shaking, and his voice wasn't. And if I stand on that dock at 4 in the morning and tell Roy Tessier that there is a man's body in that hole, and that he is about to pour concrete on it, Roy is not going to sail. He'll lose his job, Iris said. Yes. He has a family of 4 grandchildren. Ellis picked his glasses up off the table. And he'll still not sail. That's the part my uncle has never once understood about the people who work for him. He thinks the money is what holds it together. He almost laughed. It's not. It's that nobody's ever come down to the wharf and told them the truth to their face. Nolan looked at him for a long moment. Hank's boat's in Rockland. I know. You'd be on that dock alone. I've been alone on that dock my entire life, Ellis said. I just did it under a different name. He left on a lobster boat at midnight with a man from Owl's Head who owed Hank a favor from 1998, and Nolan stood on the ruined dock and watched the running lights go until they weren't lights anymore. Rook stood beside him with shoulder against his leg. Think he does it, Iris said. I think he wants to. That's not the same. No, Nolan said, but it's where it starts. I didn't sleep. He sat on the cabin floor with Wren's notebook closed in front of him and Naomi's blue book open beside it, and around 2 in the morning, he did something he had not planned and could not afterward explain. He read the names out loud. All 31, in order, slowly because some of them he had to work at, and getting a name wrong felt like a thing he had no right to do. Ines Duarte, 8. Manuel Duarte, 34. Fitim Berisha, Shung Wai Lam, Aldo Sabatini, and the 2 boys listed under him in the margin in that cramped, desperate hand. Rook lay on the floor with his head up the entire time, ears forward, and did not move. When Nolan finished, he sat there with his hand on the page. That's everybody, he said. Rook let out a breath and put his head down. Bushem, the barge did not sail at 4. Ellis called at 4:22, and his voice was so raw, Nolan almost didn't recognize it. He's not going, he said. He's not going, Nolan. He shut the pump down, and he's sitting on the deck with the crew, and he told the dispatcher there's a mechanical fault with the primary pump, and he's not moving until an engineer clears it. A ragged laugh. There's no mechanical fault. He walked over and pulled a fitting out of it himself while I was standing there. Nolan put his hand flat on the table. What did you say to him? I told him there's a man in the hole. Ellis's breathing was uneven. And Roy asked me one question. He asked me if the man had a name. And I said Tobias Wren, and he stood there for about 10 seconds, and then he said, then I'm not pouring on Tobias Wren. And he walked down the deck and broke his own pump. Naomi made a sound behind Nolan. How long does that buy? Corporate will have a barge engineer on that wharf by 9, Ellis said. So it buys until 9. But the ME team hits your water at 5:20. The state dive team came out of the dark at 5:31 in 2 boats with their deck lights on, and Nolan Briggs stood on the eastern ledge in a torn leather jacket with a dog against his leg and watched them come and had to look away for a second. Dr. Farah Okonkwo came up the rock in a survival suit with a tablet in a waterproof case, and she looked at the seam and then at him. You're Briggs. Yes, ma'am. You went in there alone, twice, after a partial collapse. 3 times. She looked at him a beat longer than was comfortable. The photographs are the cleanest amateur scene documentation I've received in 9 years, and I want you to know I was fully prepared to be wrong about you. She turned to her team lead. Set the perimeter at the ledge. I want a marker buoy on the seam before we're in the water. You'll get him out, Nolan said. Not today. Today we establish the scene we document, and we place a legal hold. Okonkwo pulled her hood up. Recovery on a submerged wreck at that depth in a collapsing quarry is a 6-month operation on a good day. Mr. Briggs, and I'm not going to lie to you about it. 6 months. He's waited 79 years, she said. He can wait for us to do it right. At 6:14 a.m., a laminated notice went up on a stake driven into the granite above the seam, and the wording on it was flat and bureaucratic, and nothing about it was beautiful. And Naomi Castellan read it 3 times and then sat down on the rock and cried, like something had finally let go of her throat. At 7:01 a.m., the hour the permit took effect, there was no barge on the water. It fell apart for Whitaker Thorne over the following 11 weeks, and it fell apart the way real things fall apart, which is to say slowly sideways and mostly on paper. Dane Corliss talked on day 4. He talked because Iris was right and Ellis was Ryder, a contract diver who has been told to open up a marker line and destabilize a condemned wedge for a liability survey, does not sleep well after a partial collapse with a man inside, and Corliss had not slept at all. And when a detective from the state police put a photograph of a cut rope in front of him, he was crying before the second question. I gave them the work order. He gave them the phone number that called him, and the phone number belonged to an operations manager at Thorn Atlantic who, faced with attempted murder, discovered a lifelong commitment to cooperating with investigators. None of it made the news that week. What made the news 6 weeks later was the insurance. Ellis had been right about that too. The war crime part, the contracts, the debt bondage, the 19 years of men who never finished paying was enormous and slow and required historians and international counsel and would take a decade. But a retroactive Hull endorsement written in 1949 to cover a 1947 loss was a form somebody had filled out wrong, and forms are what institutions understand. Marine insurers began reviewing dormant claims. Two federal agencies asked for the same set of documents in the same week. Thorn Atlantic's processing contracts began quietly not being renewed, which in that industry is how a company dies, not with a verdict with an absence of phone calls. And then a forensic accountant traced the 1953 reorganization and put a number on what had been carried forward, and the number was 128 million, and the headlines got it completely wrong. Homeless veteran and his dog find 128 miles in Island Cave. Nolan saw it on Hank's phone in the cabin and had to go stand outside. They think it's gold, he said. They think it's a story, Iris said, following him out. It's easier. It's not money. It's not money, Iris. It's what a company kept after they... I know what it is. It's a bill, he turned around. That's all that number is. It's a bill that came due 79 years late, and every dollar of it belongs to people who got put on a boat with contracts they couldn't read. Iris let him get it out. Then say that, she said, every time, to every one of them. So he did. He said it to the Portland paper and to a national wire service and to a producer who wanted to fly a crew out, and he said it badly the first 3 times and better after that. And the correction never traveled as far as the headline because corrections never do. He also said no to a great many things. He said no to the documentary. He said no to the book. He said no to a man who wanted to know if the island was available for exclusive survival content. And Hank took that call because Nolan had made the mistake of leaving the phone on the porch rail. No, Hank said into it, the island is not available for your nonsense. Try a sandbar with low self-esteem. He hung up and looked at Nolan. You're welcome. Under the table, Rook thumped his tail once. He had come to tolerate Hank considerably since discovering that the man's jacket pockets were an unreliable but non-zero source of biscuits he loudly denied carrying. Whitaker Thorne was indicted in October on charges that had nothing to do with 1947. That was the thing nobody outside the room ever understood, and the thing Iris had told Nolan on the first day powerful men almost never fall for the enormous thing. They fall for the small procedural thing they did last year while trying to keep the enormous thing buried. Conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. Obstruction. Tampering with an active death investigation. He did not get dragged out in handcuffs. He surrendered at a courthouse in a Navy coat with 3 attorneys and made a statement about a proud family legacy and a regrettable rush to judgment, and it was carried on the 6 o'clock news for 90 seconds, and then it was gone. Nolan watched it with the sound off. That's it, Hank said. That's it? Doesn't feel like anything. No, Nolan said, it doesn't. And that was, he thought, the most honest thing about the whole business. He'd expected some feeling to arrive, some clean, hot flood of it, and instead there was a man in a coat on a screen in a hollow place where satisfaction was supposed to go. He went outside and sat on the step, and Rook came and put his head on his knee, and Nolan sat there for a long time with his hand on that skull and thought about how nothing that had ever actually mattered to him had arrived with a feeling attached. He did not sell the island. He could have. After the story broke, he could have sold it 11 times over, and the offers that came were not from fish companies anymore. They were from people who used words like legacy asset and immersive heritage experience. And one of them was for enough money that Iris put the letter face down on the table before she slid it to him. He turned them all down. I didn't make a speech about it. He just didn't sign, and Iris said later that not signing is the most expensive form of courage there is because it costs you every single day and nobody ever sees you paying. What he did instead took 8 months and most of the salvage award, which was real and which was the only money Nolan ever took out of any of it. The payroll silver went to the state as evidence, and from there into a compensation fund that Naomi and two lawyers in Lisbon and one in Halifax spent a year building. The wreck stayed where it was under a legal hold that Okonkwo renewed twice. Rackline was designated a protected marine memorial site, which meant no tour boats, no dock, no gift shop, no reenactment of anybody's last night for people eating popcorn in rain jackets. The island had spent enough decades being useful to men who monetized other people's suffering. They built a wall instead. It was low and it was stone and it faced east, and two masons out of Rockland did the work in fair weather over a summer, and Naomi would not let a single name be carved until she had written to the family and received an answer. Some families answered in a week. Some took 4 months. Some never answered at all, and Naomi did not push, and when Nolan asked her about it, she said that silence is also an answer, and not every wound is ready for air. The first name went up in June. Ines Duarte, 8, 1939 to 1947. Nolan stood next to Naomi while the mason finished the last letter, and he found he could not swallow. He had read that name by flashlight in cold water, with 40 feet of granite over his head and a body 8 feet away, and seeing it cut into stone under open sky did something to him he had no vocabulary for. Rook sat at his left, where he always sat. Naomi closed her blue notebook. "Now she has a place," she said. "Is that enough?" "No," Naomi said, "but it isn't nothing." That became the phrase on Rackline. Not enough, not nothing. It fit the island. It fit the whole business. Honestly, the indictment that felt like nothing, the recovery that would take 6 months and then took 18, the families who wrote back and the families who didn't. He moved into the cabin in September and sold the van for $400. The first night he woke at 2:13 with his hand out in front of him, closed on nothing, and the room was too wide, and the bed was too still, and the sea was too close, and the panic came up through him like an old creditor who had found his new address. Rook was there before the second breath, shoulder into the ribs, steady, unmoving pressure. Stay. Nolan slid down onto the floor and sat with his back to the bed frame, and both hands in that brown gold coat until the window went gray. And somewhere in that stretch, for the first time in 9 years, he said it out loud. "I let go on purpose," he said. Rook's ear moved. "There were 3 guys behind me in that passage, and the hatch had 10 seconds, and I made a decision with my hand." His voice was flat and ruined. "It wasn't the water. It was never the water. I've been telling everybody it was the water." The dog leaned harder. "His name was Marcus Vale, and he said my name once." Nolan said, "And I have never once said his." He put his forehead down on the top of Rook's skull and stayed there a while. Nothing was fixed. He understood that. He'd learned by then that healing wasn't a door you got through. It was a tide in and out, some mornings leaving the wreckage visible, some mornings covering all of it and asking you to trust that the ground was still down there. But he had said it in a room with a witness, and the witness had not moved, and that was the first thing. The families started coming in the spring. Hank ferried every one of them and complained about all of it, the bags, the flowers, the casseroles, the number of people who did not know how to step onto a boat. He installed a padded mat near the bow after an elderly woman had trouble standing during a crossing, and when Nolan noticed it, Hank said the boat needed the balance. "It has flowers on it." Balance can be decorative. Some came with photographs. Some came with prayers in languages nobody on the island spoke. One woman from New Bedford brought a christening gown that had belonged to a sister of a man on the list and stood at the wall holding it against her chest for 20 minutes without saying anything at all. And a great many of them came with the same story told in different accents, which Nolan eventually understood was the real damage, the thing the money would never touch. He stopped writing. We always thought he stopped writing because he didn't want us. Nolan heard it 11 times before he stopped counting. He thought about his mother at her kitchen table with a nail in the board and the wood grown over it. He started saying something back. It wasn't much. He'd say he didn't stop writing. Somebody stopped the letters. And most of the time the person would nod politely and it wouldn't land, and once in a while it would, and he'd watch 70 years come off somebody's face in about 4 seconds, and he'd have to go stand by the water. In August, on a Tuesday with no ceremony at all, Naomi came out of the cabin holding her phone with both hands, and her face was wrong in a way Nolan had never seen on her. "Nolan," he stood up, "I've been working the Duarte line for 14 months, she said. "Ines and her father, Manuel. There was a brother listed in the margin. Ren wrote the boy, no name, no age, and I've never been able to place him, and I assumed he was aboard, and Ren just didn't get to him." "Naomi, I wasn't aboard. She looked up and her eyes were enormous. Nolan, he wasn't aboard, and I've just spent 40 minutes on the phone with a woman in Lisbon who says her grandfather is 96 years old and has never once talked about America. Rook stood up. Say it, Nolan said. Naomi put a hand over her mouth and took it away again. There's a survivor, she said. His name was Emil Duarte, and for 79 years he had believed he was the only person alive who knew what had happened, which is a specific kind of solitude that has no word in any language. Naomi did not call him, she wrote. That was the first argument, and it lasted 2 days. Iris wanted a phone call and a recorded statement inside 48 hours because Iris had spent a year building a compensation architecture, and a living witness to a 1947 concealment was the single most valuable document on Earth. Naomi said no. He's 96, she said. He has said nothing for 79 years. If the first thing that reaches him is a lawyer asking him to confirm facts, he will say he doesn't remember, and he will be telling the truth because that's what a man's mind does to protect him after that long. And if he dies in the meantime, then he dies having been written to like a person, Naomi said, instead of interviewed like a file. Iris looked at her for a long moment and then took her glasses off and rubbed her eyes. Write the letter, she said. Naomi wrote it in Portuguese with help from a translator in Lisbon, and it was 4 sentences long. It said that a boat had been found. It said that a list had been found aboard, written by a mate named Tobias Wren. It said that on that list, in the margin beside Manuel Duarte, there was a note about a boy. And it said, we are not asking you for anything. We are writing because you should know that someone found them. The reply came 11 days later. It was 1 page handwritten in a script that shook and did not stop. Which pier, it said. Naomi read it out loud in the cabin and then put it down on the table and sat back and said, oh, very quietly, and Nolan didn't understand until Hank did. He's testing you, Hank said. There were 2 piers. Everybody in Rockhaven knows about the town pier. Nobody's ever heard of the second one except the people who got put on a boat from it at night. Naomi wrote back 1 word, second. Emil Duarte's granddaughter called 4 days later and said her grandfather had gone into his room after reading the letter and had not come out for 6 hours, and when he came out, he had asked her to book a flight. He came in October, which Hank said was the worst possible month, and then arranged the entire crossing himself twice because he did not trust the first plan he had made. Nolan met the boat. He'd rehearsed nothing. He'd tried the night before, standing in the cabin like an idiot working on a sentence, and Rook had watched him do it with an expression of open concern, and he'd given up around midnight. So he just stood on the rebuilt dock in his flannel and the rust-orange jacket with the split at the elbow, still stitched in fishing line, because Naomi had told him to leave it, and he watched a very old man come across 8 miles of water toward a rock he had spent 79 years not thinking about. Emil Duarte was small and folded down by time, and he refused every hand offered to him getting off the boat except one. He took Hank's. You are the boatman, he said in English worn smooth by decades of other languages. I am. Your father. Emil did not let go of the hand. Was he here in that year? Hank Pelletier's mouth opened and nothing came out of it. He was 14, Nolan said. Emil turned and looked up at Hank for a long time. There was a boy on the pier, he said, in the dark. He was trying to start an engine and it would not start, and he was crying and hitting it with his hand. His grip tightened. I was on the road above. I was watching. He did not know anyone was watching him. Hank made a sound and put his other hand over his eyes and stood there on the dock of an island in October, holding a stranger's hand, and nobody said anything for about a minute and a half. Then Emil said, he tried. Tell him that someone saw him try. He's been dead 19 years, Hank got out. Then tell him anyway, Emil said. That is how it works, Jam. They did not take him to the wall first. Naomi was very firm about it. They took him to the cabin and sat him down and gave him tea and let him look at the water for 20 minutes without anyone asking him a single question. Rook decided about him in under a minute. Nolan had never seen the dog do it that fast with anybody. Not Iris, not Naomi, not Hank. Rook crossed the room, sat down directly in front of the old man's chair, and put his chin on Emil's knee. Emil put a hand on his head like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. This is the one, he said. That's Rook. He found the boat. He found the door, Nolan said. I found the boat. Emil looked at him with an expression that Nolan could not read at all. No, he said, you came back for the boat. That is a different thing, and you should not confuse them. So he talked for 4 hours that afternoon, and Naomi wrote it all down by hand. And Iris, who had flown up for this and who had a recorder in her bag, and a legal team on standby in Portland, never once took the recorder out. While he was 17 in November of 1947, he had been in the country 11 months. His father, Manuel, had signed a contract in Lisbon that promised passage, housing, and work at the cannery. And by the time they understood what the deductions meant, they were 4,000 miles from anyone who could read the paper for them. His sister Inez was 8. She had come because their mother had died in Portugal and there had been nowhere to leave her. On the night of the 4th, the men were told there was night work at the second pier, a run up the coast, 2 days extra pay against the balance. 40 of them went down, 31 boarded. Emil was one of the 9 sent back. Why, Nolan said. Because I was 17 and I had a bad arm. Emil held up his left, which had never straightened properly. I broke it in September on the line. The foreman said the boat needed men who could lift. He said it like it was a kindness. He was annoyed with me. He stopped. My father put my sister on that boat because he did not want to leave her sleeping alone in the house, he said, and I did not go because of an arm. Nobody said anything. I have thought about that arm for 79 years, Emil said. He had walked to the shore road when the weather came up. He had watched. And what he had seen, and this was the part where Iris finally quietly took out a pen, was that the Providence Ann had not gone out into open water. She had gone north close in undertow. You're certain, Iris said. There was no storm yet. Emil's voice did not waver. The storm came the next day. Everyone says the storm. There was rain. There was wind from the northeast, small. I have been on the sea my whole life since then, madam. I know the difference between a boat in weather and a boat on a rope. Did you tell anyone? I told the foreman. He told me I was mistaken and upset. Emil's hands were flat on the table. I told a police officer in Rockland 8 days later. He wrote nothing down. I watched him not write. He looked up. I was 17 and my English was 40 words, and I had a paper in my pocket that said I owed a company $1,100. Do you understand what I was? Yes, Naomi said. I was nothing that could be believed, he said, so I stopped. He had left Maine in 1949 under a different surname. Duarte dropped H, a clerk's mistake. He had chosen not to correct because a mistake was a wall, and had gone to sea and had gone back to Portugal in 1961 and had married and had children and grandchildren and a great-grandchild, and he had never told any of them. Why not, Nolan asked. Because there was nothing to tell, Emil said it simply. A story requires a second person. If you say my sister was murdered, and there is no boat and no paper and no body, and no one who agrees, then you have not told a story. You have only told them that their grandfather is a sad man. He turned his cup on the table. I did not want to give my children a father who was a sad man about something that could not be shown. Naomi put her pen down. You were waiting for evidence, she said. I was waiting for anything. Emil looked at her. And then a woman writes me a letter and she knows about the second pier, and she knows Ren's name. You knew him. He gave me an apple, Emil said, on the 6th of October. I remember because I could not believe a ship's officer had given me an apple. He was quiet a moment. He asked me my father's name. He wrote it in a book. I thought he was writing me up for something. Naomi's hand went to her mouth. I was writing you down, she said. They took him to the wall the next morning. He would not use the arm anyone offered. He walked it himself slowly with a cane on the granite, and Rook walked beside him the entire way, at the speed of a 96-year-old man, which Nolan had never once seen him do for anybody. There were 9 names carved by then. Emil stopped in front of them and read them one at a time out loud, and his pronunciation was not the Masons and not Naomi's and not Nolan's. It was theirs. It was how they had said their own names. He got to INS Duarte 8, and he stopped. He stood there a long time. Then he said something in Portuguese that Naomi did not translate and never wrote down, and he put his hand flat on the stone and he did not cry. She was afraid of the dark, he said finally in English to nobody. That is the thing. Everyone will want to know something large, and there is nothing large. She was afraid of the dark, and I used to sit with her. Hank turned around and walked away. Nolan stayed. After a while, Emil said without turning, You are the one who went in the water. Yes. How many times? 3. And the third time it came down on you. Yes, Emil nodded slowly. Come here, he said. Nolan came and stood beside him. Look at me, Emil said, and Nolan did, and the old man took his forearm in a grip that had no business being that strong. I am going to say a thing to you, and you will not like it, and I am 96 and I do not have time to say it gently. All right, you did not do this for us. Emil's eyes did not move. You did not know us. You could not have. You did this because you have a thing in your own water that you did not go back for, and you found a hole in the ground where you could go back for someone. Nolan's whole chest went hollow. I am not accusing you. The grip tightened. I am telling you it counts anyway. That is the whole of what I came to say to you. It counts anyway, Mr. Briggs. A man does not have to have clean reasons. He only has to go. Nolan stood there on the granite with his throat closed and an old man's hand on his arm. His name was Marcus Vale, he said. Emil nodded like this was the most reasonable thing he had ever heard. Then that is a name too, he said. Put it somewhere. They found the bell in November, and they found it because of the dog, and Nolan would spend the rest of his life declining to make it sound like more than it was. The recovery operation had been running 18 months by then, far longer than Okonkwo's 6, because everything about that quarry was worse than anybody had estimated, and because twice they'd had to stop entirely and reshore the cut. The state team had brought Tobias Wren up in April in a procedure that took 9 days, and that Nolan watched from the ledge every hour of, and a forensic anthropologist in Augusta had confirmed him from a healed forearm fracture that Wren had noted in his own logbook in 1943. I was buried in Rockhaven in May with a Coast Guard honor detail, and 400 people, most of whom had grown up with a plaque that said 31 fishermen. But the hull had never given up anything else, and everyone had stopped expecting it to. Then in November, on a low tide with the wind wrong, Rook went to a place on the ledge 60 feet north of the seam and would not leave it. He didn't bark at first, he just stood there. Nolan noticed at midday and ignored it. He noticed again at 3 and came down. What? Rook barked. 3, short, even, spaced. Nolan felt the back of his neck go cold. Say that again. 3 more. He called Okonkwo's site lead, who came over with a probe and a thermal reader out of professional courtesy and mild condescension, and who found a void behind 11 inches of collapsed fill that did not appear on any survey of the quarry because it was not part of the quarry. It was the forward third of the Providence Ann. She had broken. That was the thing nobody had understood. In 79 years, the hull in the main void was the after 2/3, and the bow had separated at some point, either in the towing or in the settling, and had gone into a side fissure and been sealed by a rockfall, which meant it had never flooded the way the rest had. They opened it in February. Inside were personal effects: a wooden trunk, shoes, a rosary, a child's coat wool small with a name stitched inside the collar by a mother in Portugal who had died before any of it, and the bell, the ship's bell bronze green with age with Providence Ann and 1919 cast into it hanging from a bracket that had not let go. Nolan stood on the ledge when they brought it up, and he had to sit down on the rock, and Rook came and put his head on his knee and stayed there. And Nolan said into the top of his skull so quietly that nobody heard it, "You found the door twice." They hung the bell at the wall in June. It took 3 men and a frame, and the masons came back for free, and Emil Duarte flew from Lisbon, a second time, at 97 years old against the explicit advice of 2 doctors and 1 daughter. And when Naomi told him that on the phone, he said, "Then they can be angry at my funeral, which they will attend regardless." By then, there were 26 names on the wall. 5 families had never answered. Naomi kept their entries in the blue notebook and did not carve them, and told anyone who asked that the wall was not finished and would not be finished, and that this was correct. There was no stage. There were no speeches written to be applauded. There were about 90 people on an island that had never held more than a dozen standing on grass, and Hank had made 4 crossings, starting at 6 in the morning, and had complained about every single one of them, and had shaved for the first time in 11 years. Ellis Thorne came. That had been an argument too, and a longer one, and Nolan had ended it by saying that a man who stood on a dock at 4 in the morning and told the truth to Roy Tessier's face had bought the right to stand on grass. He'd testified for 11 days. He'd been dropped from the family trust, which he had said was the least surprising sentence ever spoken aloud. He was teaching at a small college in Nova Scotia under his own name for the first time in his life, and Naomi said he looked 10 years younger and about 40% more frightened. Roy Tessier came to with 3 of his grandchildren and did not talk to anybody and stood at the back and left on the first boat. Whitaker Thorne was that morning 14 months into a sentence at a federal facility in Pennsylvania. He had taken a plea in the end. His attorneys had been very good and the sentence was not long, and Nolan had stopped somewhere in the second year, expecting that part to feel like anything. Naomi read the names. She got to 19 and her voice went, and Hank coughed loudly and elaborately into his fist for about 8 seconds so that she could stop without having to admit she needed to, and then she finished. Then Emil Duarte rang the bell. He had asked to do it, and nobody had argued. He stood with a cane in his left hand and the lanyard in his right, and he rang it 31 times, and between each one, he waited until the sound had gone completely out of the air. It took almost 4 minutes. Nobody moved for any of it. On the 8th stroke, a woman from New Bedford put her face in her hands. On the 22nd, a man who had flown from Halifax got down on the grass and stayed down. On the 29th, Rook, who had been sitting at Nolan's left through the entire thing, through crowds and strangers, and the enormous bronze noise, stood up, walked over to Emil Duarte, and sat down against his leg to hold him up. Emil rang the last 2 with his hand on the dog's head. Nolan spoke at the end because Iris said somebody had to, and everyone looked at him. He hadn't written anything. He had the cracked barometer in his hand because he'd carried it that morning without deciding to, and the needle was still seized hard over on Storm where it had been since before he was born. My Uncle Abel got called crazy for 40 years, he said. He had to stop and start again. He lived on this rock, and he wrote down what the water did every day, and everybody in Rockhaven, including my own mother, decided that meant he'd left us. He turned the barometer over in his hands. He didn't leave. He stayed so long in one place that everybody called it leaving. He looked at the wall. He got down into that hole at least once. We'll never know when or how, and he cut 2 letters into a plate of steel next to a man nobody was coming for, and then he came back up and never told a living soul because who was going to believe him? He had no boat, no gear, no money, no proof, and a company that owned the coast. Nolan's voice roughened. So he did the only thing he could do. He didn't sell. 40 years of not selling. That was the whole plan. Just refuse every day until somebody showed up. He stopped. I almost signed, he said. I want that said out loud in front of these families because I'm not going to stand at this wall and be a better man than I was. I had a pen in my hand and a number on the table, and I was 3 seconds from it. He looked down, and this dog put his paw on the paper. Rook, hearing his cue in the tone the way he had always heard everything, chose that exact moment to lean his full weight sideways into Nolan's leg and nearly took him off his feet. 90 people laughed. It was wet, and it broke wrong, and it was the best sound the island had ever made. Nolan steadied himself and put a hand on that brown gold head and gave up on the rest of what he'd been going to say. I was trained to find my way through black water, he said. It's the only thing I was ever good at, and I'd have walked right past that door. Every day of my life, I'd have walked past it. He looked at the dog. He kept coming to find me until I finally stayed found. That's it. That's the whole thing. Emil Duarte died 14 months later in Lisbon in his own bed with his granddaughter reading to him. She told Naomi on the phone that in the last year he had talked about his sister every single day, that he'd told the great-grandchildren about her, that she was afraid of the dark, that she sang that she had a coat with her name in the collar, that he'd kept a photograph of a stone wall on a rock in Maine on the table beside his chair and had shown it to visitors within about 4 minutes of them sitting down. I was not a sad man about it, she said. At the end, he became something else about it. I don't have the word in English. You don't need one, Naomi said. Rook died on a Tuesday in his 11th year in the cabin in the afternoon with his head on Nolan's boot. It had been coming for months, and Nolan had known it and had done all the things a man does. The vet in Rockland, the medication, the ramp he built for the porch step that the dog used exactly twice out of what looked a great deal like spite. At the end, he was slow and silver from the eyes forward, and he still walked the east ledge every single morning, all the way to the wall, and sat down and looked at the water and would not come back until he was ready. Nolan sat on the floor with him for the last 6 hours. He didn't say much. There wasn't much. Around 4 in the afternoon, Rook's breathing changed the way Nolan's used to at 3:40 in a van behind a lobster co-op, And Nolan did the only thing he knew how to do. He put his shoulder against the dog's ribs, and he held it there. Steady, unmoving, the way you hold a door shut against wind. "I'm here," he said. "You hear me? I'm here. 9 years you did this. I've got it." He kept it there a long time after it stopped being necessary. They buried him at the wall, not in it, beside it at the north end facing the water, and the masons came back a third time and would not take money for that either. The stone is small and it says Rook, and under that it says the only thing Nolan could think of that was true, which is he found the door. Nolan Briggs still lives on Rackline. He's 51 now. The beard is going gray and he keeps it short because the habit outlived the reason. He still wears the orange leather jacket with fishing line in the elbow, and Naomi has told him 3 times that he should replace it, and he has agreed 3 times and not done it. The wall has 29 names. 2 families have still never answered, and Naomi, who is 71 and shows no sign of stopping, writes to their last known addresses every January. The recovery is finished. The compensation fund has paid out to 14 families in 4 countries, and Iris says it will be another decade, and she's still doing it, and she still puts her hand flat on her sternum when something goes wrong. Hank died in his boat at the wheel at 76 on a calm morning, which everyone agreed was the most obnoxious possible exit and exactly what he would have chosen. And every morning at first light, Nolan Briggs walks the east ledge to a low stone wall above a hole in the granite, and he reads the names and he says them out loud in the pronunciation Emil taught him, and at the end of the list, he adds one more that isn't carved anywhere. Marcus Vale. Then he stands there a while with his hand on a small stone at the north end, and he goes back and starts the day. He inherited a worthless island. Everybody said so, the lawyers, the town, the company, that offered him enough money to end his whole life's arithmetic in an afternoon. 41 acres of rock and salt and back taxes. They were wrong about all of it, and a dog knew first.